The List, Part 2. Cold water filled Miles's nostrils, jerking him from dreams of dead staring faces back to awareness. His face was wet and chilled as he shook his head and retched. Miles cracked one eye even as he coughed and cleared the last water from his throat. He was on a bed. The sheets had the slightly musty smell of a room that's been closed for a season or more. His hands had fallen asleep under him. He understood why when he tried to move them. They were tied together. Kenner stood there, dressed in the same mountaineering jacket, pack and boots, an empty bucket hanging from one hand, a knife in the other. He was framed in the light of the hall and smoking a cigarette. Miles could smell that they were his. "Hans wants you. Do I prod you with this?" Kenner shook his knife hand. "Or do you play nice?" Miles turned his hips and dragged his feet off the bed. His head swam and his stomach rebelled, but he'd be damned if he'd give Kenner any show of that. "Do lead on, Mr. Kenner." The hatred he felt for the man who'd been paid to deliver him to his captors colored every word. Kenner nodded and made a get-up gesture with the blade of the knife. Miles rose, and the world rippled in his vision. He barely managed to avoid slamming into the frame of the door, but clamped his jaw and forced the world to settle. "I don't suppose these might be removed?" he asked in the hall, holding his tied hands up towards Kenner under the flickering light of a bare bulb towards where Kenner stood warily a few paces away. He shook his head, but the exchange gave Miles more than a second to collect himself before the Swiss-German traitor poked him towards the stairs with the tip of his blade. Miles started walking, brain-searching through recent events for any advantage he could find or manufacture. He had been sent to Zermatt, Switzerland, with the thinnest of intelligence. A German contingency was heading for the same village to bed alongside others for some sort of list. Miles had been dispatched to determine the content of the list and the identity of those bidding for it, on the principle that anything the Germans were willing to risk the peace treaty that had ended the Great War for was worth stealing away from them. His guide to the meeting now held him at knife point, and a number of other men had suffered death by violence, and been abandoned to the cold of the Matterhorn in a ravine below the chalet Miles found himself in now. A cocked-up situation, to say the least, Miles thought. He stopped at the top of the stairs. The room was dark below. Kenner stopped, feet behind. "Pray tell a man on the way to the gallows, Kenner," he asked. "Is there a list, or was it just a trap for the poor souls up there? And me," Miles thought dourly. Kenner exhaled, dropped his stolen cigarette to the floor, and ground it out. "Yes, I brought a list to sell. They paid me at once. The auction, a fiction." A rage bloomed in Miles' chest. Kenner was the seller? This was deceit piled on deceit. Why then would he alert the Swiss, and through them London? Perhaps Kenner divined the question even as Miles had it, for he continued. "They wanted the British to know as well. Testing the waters, so he said." Miles said nothing, not trusting himself capable of any verbal fencing, so thoroughly was he shaken. This Hans was unknown to Miles, and therefore his handlers. Yet he exerted enough influence over a lieutenant-colonel of Germany to steer what was left of the man through international intrigue. Worse yet, Hans had boasted right before the old man of his plans to take that life. And what other changes did he and his friends have planned for Germany? So confident he was, this man, that he had left the security of whatever shadows cloaked him in his fatherland, not only to secure this mysterious list, but also to lure and eliminate those who might also covet said list. These summoners. Miles knew of the Thule Society, German occultists seeking a promised land to lead them back to warmongering salvation. They were crackpots, and of little interest to Miles. But a faction of the German military using the rich and influential members of that crackpot fraternity to unknown and deadly aims. Oh yes, his masters would want very much to learn what that was all about. Wheels within wheels within wheels, and all a mystery to Whitehall. Miles knew his duty. Procure the list for Whitehall, along with everything he could glean about Hans and his victims for the big brains to decipher. Oh, and survive to deliver it home. He started down the stairs. And what exactly were your dead guests? What did Hans call them? Summoners. What were they hoping to accomplish with this list? Halfway down the stairs now, Miles could look around the living room he'd been received and dealt with in just hours ago. It was much changed. The chairs, rugs, and sofa were pressed to the corners of the room. A chalk circle was drawn on the hardwood. No, 2 circles, with sigils between the inner and outer, in greater number than the hours of the day on the face of a clock. Candles were the only illumination, revealing a beetle-like shape in the center of the room. Miles waited for his eyes to fully adjust to the gloom, and soon he could make out the beetle shape. It was Hans, his spy's trench coat turned in for a robe. He was bent in half and carefully finishing a chalk hieroglyph around one of the candles, the many candles, in the room. Miles realized then the nature of the summoning practiced by all those who had sought the list and died for their troubles, and he felt an even greater sorrow for their deaths, demanded by nothing so noble as defending the peace in Europe, but simply a shared fetish for the occult. They died for nothing. Really, Hans, after the speech you gave teasing your poor lieutenant colonel, I'm a bit surprised to see you dressed for the costume party. Hans laughed then in the shadows and continued scrawling. After a time he grunted in satisfaction with his art project and stood. Yeah, you are so sure you know the ways of this world, you and your King George. So untouchable and so superior across the waves in your island fortress. He bowed deeply again, uttering a few words of what? Miles strained his ears. The words were familiar to him, though he'd never heard them actually spoken before. He recalled those strange, stilted phrases from one of the many and varied classes designed to hone his natural gifts for language. Is that Aramaic, Hans? Curiosity gnawed at him to hear those words again, but pride prevented his asking. I've seen stranger rooms in get-ups meant to scare holy hell out of the interrogated. I've seen stranger rooms in get-ups meant to scare holy hell out of the interrogated man. But I am touched you thought enough of me to polish up on your dead Sumerian languages, Hans. Something glinted in the air near Hans. A sound followed. Drip, drip, drip. The dripping continued, the sounds falling further apart before disappearing completely. He patiently and seriously turned and bowed towards the inscriptions in the center of the circle before crossing the threshold. The spy's mood changed then. Oh, this old thing. Hans unclasped the robe and let it fall to the ground. Just observing proper form, dear boy. He turned, and Miles could see red-stained bandages over the man's right wrist. Miles stared dumbly for a moment, then raised his eyes. Hans met his gaze and nodded. Yes, Knight of the Empire, or whatever you are. I made good sport of old Eugen, but do not think my beliefs are as baseless as his. A scuffle at the top of the stairs interrupted Hans. Miles turned to see Eugen being dragged down the stairs by 2 soldiers. What is the meaning of this? Man, release me at once! I'll have you beaten in the square! Release me! The soldiers hauled their commanding officer to the main floor and brought him to stand beside Hans and Miles. Ah, Eugen, just in time. Hans clapped the old man on the shoulder. Eugen bristled and drew his bathrobe around him as if it were a king's clothing. Miles looked around. Soldiers were coming down the stairs, coming in from the hall and stepping through the patio door. Release you? Hans asked and shook his head. But, Oberstleutnant, this is the moment you've been waiting for all your life. He stretched his hand out past Miles, indicating the circle. Before you lay a great symbol of power. Suitable sacrifices have been given, he said, rubbing his bandaged wrist as he did so. And all is ready. Eugen harumphed, and made to gather the robe tighter around himself, then stared past Hans at the floor. Was ist das? He asked, and stepped imperiously forward. Hans made no move to stop him. Eugen brushed past Miles, but his regal step faltered as he approached the circle's edge, and stopped short of the outer line Hans had drawn. His head jerked then, as if he'd caught a whiff of something rotten, and he whirled to face them. What have you done? Eugen whispered, his voice thin, reedy, frightened. Stop this at once! Did you not wish to unleash the ancient powers for your Germany? The color had left Eugen's face, and he drew the robe around him differently now, as if he were chilled to the bone, as if he were a frightened child cowering behind a curtain. Something malevolent crawled into Hans's voice. Your time is past. Your Germany is no more. It is our time now. My time. Miles felt a growing dread. He'd previously chalked up to his own death and the monstrous company he fell into. Now a shiver flicked through him and ice-chilled his spine, and his leg twitched, desiring to fly him away from the wrongness growing in this room. Eugen whimpered. Please, I only meant to... He licked his lips, and his eyes grew wide. Fright lived behind them, terror, and as Miles watched, he saw Eugen's reason take its leave again. Instead of the former happy confusion, only the fear of an animal remained etched in the wrinkles of his old face. The soldiers lit more candles around the room, drew more stands with candles on them around the circle, and angry flame revealed the true horror of Hans's art. Hearts, intestine, and other organs Miles couldn't identify and didn't want to, had been placed with great care amidst the hieroglyphs in the circle. Your fellow bidder's champion of England. Greed for the list delivered so many to us. It's always so nice to offer such a full plate at a summoning. Hans walked closer to Eugen. Cruelty worked into the angles of his smile again. When Miles moved to step between him, instinctively protective, a strong hand pulled him back, and a blade pressed flat at his throat for extra motivation. Let them be, Kenner warned. Yes, England, Hans taunted, wrapping an arm over Eugen's shoulder and drawing him close. Let me enjoy myself after so many years enduring my Oberstleutnant's less than kind orders. Eugen stared into Hans's eyes as Hans guided him away from Miles's view, both men inching forward until the soles of their shoes crossed the outer line of the great circle. You have no clue what's happening here, Hans jeered over his shoulder, eyes still savoring the animal terror on Eugen's face, and the confusion on Miles. It seems I can strike merry old England off my to-do list for now. You stand right there, he murmured, and Miles heard the snick of metal. And I will give you a glimpse of what's to come. Hans pulled Eugen close, and the old man gasped. A glimpse of what's to come for your England. Miles jerked against Kenner's arm, and he felt the long, heavy weight of Kenner's knife prick at his neck. The pain kept him in place as Hans and Eugen jerked again and again as one. Then Eugen fell to his knees, sighing, and again something wet dripped in the darkness. Hans patted Eugen's head as he shuddered, and then fell to the ground, and then lay still. Another officer who paid for his rank by peddling his influence removed, Hans muttered to himself. This alone is a boon for the fatherland. Miles felt heat rush to his face. He let the anger come and let it smother his fear. He was an old man. You didn't have to. Hans spun to face him, the blade of his small knife shining through the red gore that covered it, and the fingers clutching it. Hold your tongue, or I'll have Kenner take it. His face was alive with a twisted pleasure, and Miles would now wager madness. Miles looked away. There was no cowardice in the act, just as there were no heroics in dying before he could deliver to his country the strange tale of what would transpire this evening. He watched the candle's reflection dance in the shiny wetness spreading from the old man's body. Miles found himself drawn to stare at the spreading patch of red without knowing why, until he saw the blood was not simply spilling from its host, but rather each rivulet was channeling itself back together, against the laws of nature, coming back slowly together to travel outwards, only along the borderline of the circle. Gott in Himmel! One of the guards wailed, but Miles heard a rough slap and rougher words of warning from the guards' fellows. Hans ignored the outburst. He stepped over Eugen's newly made corpse and walked along the blood as it inched slowly, impossibly, around the floor. The flames were flaring higher now, the room growing brighter, as if some magician's powder had been tossed into the candles all around. Mr. Kenner, I have honored my half of the bargain. None of those summoned have lived to report your capitalism. Now, the list, please. What about this one? Kenner asked, his voice empty of emotion. The blade he held to Miles' carotid didn't waver. Miles let his anger over the confident man's betrayal stoke even higher, a refuge from his fear of the horrible and inexplicable playing out all around him. Hans continued his slow pace around the circle, matching the blood. It had engulfed half the circle already. "Oh, but I am so enjoying our talk. There are men at every exit with very loud guns. Have no fear of our intrepid friend's escape." As if on cue, the snick-snick of bolts being drawn sounded from every corner. "The list. Now, if you please." Heavy footsteps marked a man's approach behind Miles. They were followed by something small and hard pressing into Miles's ribs. He had been held at gunpoint before and recognized the feeling. "Watch carefully," Kenner warned Miles's new guard. The knife at his throat disappeared. "Oh, much obliged," Miles said dryly. His only response was the rifle muzzle roughly prodding into his back. Kenner walked around the circle to the left, meeting Hans on the far side in front of the window. Hans sighed, reluctantly letting the blood seep past as Kenner stopped in front of him. The blood continued its journey back towards its owner's body, near Miles's feet, while Hans pulled a leather pouch from the small of his back and passed it to Kenner. The agreed amount in Swiss francs. Kenner opened the pouch and took his time, examining the notes inside, as carefully as he might pore over a newspaper. At long length he placed them back in the pouch and stowed it inside his own jacket. Then he removed his cap, and from the lining he pulled out a ragged, yellowed strip of paper. The fabled list at long last, Miles thought. He watched as Kenner passed the list to Hans. "I leave you to it," Kenner said, and turned towards the closest exit, the patio door leading to the violated bodies of the bidders, the airship moored behind the chalet, and the mountain Kenner knew so well. But Hans snapped his fingers before Kenner reached the door, and again the sound of rifle bolts sliding home echoed through the room. Kenner turned slowly, his hands remaining at his sides. "We agreed on payment and free passage upon acceptance of the list," he said. "We did," Hans agreed. "However, I think you will stay until we have sampled the wares we paid you so highly for." Hans looked across the circle to Miles. "I'm sure you'd agree it was fair," he said, taking obvious pleasure in the exchange. "Oh, most fair," Miles said, clasping his hands behind his back. "Can't have you leaving us to man the party alone, Kenner, old chap." "Quite," Hans replied happily. Miles was torn between hoping Kenner would be rewarded for his service with a quick death, and hoping his betrayers survived long enough that he himself could administer a more fitting punishment. His blood was up, and he could think of oh so many ways to repay Kenner. The hiss and spit of the candles was the only sound, as all eyes rested on Kenner and Hans. Kenner stood stock still another moment, staring through the window to the dark shapes of the mountain, then turned and nodded once. "Very well. Begin." Hans laughed. "Begin," he replied in a gruff, mocking tone. "So serious. You really must learn to enjoy your work more." Hans sighed. "Very well. I, too, am eager to have this game begun." A strange wet sound drew Miles' attention to the floor. Disbelief was banished by the proof of his own eyes, as old Eugen's blood slid across the floor like some impossible waterfall back into the larger mass of red that pooled around the lieutenant colonel's body. The blood had circumnavigated Hans's grotesque etchings. More unsettling still, some force had sculpted the blood's passage around Hans's gory etchings into that most perfect circle. "Yes," Hans hissed in pleasure as his eyes trailed down the list. His lips parted, and awkward sounds passed through them. The architecture of the sounds were too unfamiliar even to Miles's trained ear. The candles flared again, pyrotechnics owing to no earthly reason. Miles felt the barrel at his ribs relax. The soldier behind him gasped, and around the circle many of Eugen's guards did the same. Some took involuntary steps away from candles near them as their flickering light grew into gouts of flame. Miles attempted to hold on to the words Hans was reading. He also recalculated his odds of escape, factoring in the raw nerves and inattention now plaguing the soldiers. He wanted to scream at the unnatural events playing out before him. The murders, the hidden agenda, that damned creeping blood. He took a deep breath. He paused, and remembered that at the very last, duty won. King and country, Miles. King and country. Another awkward string of sounds fell from Hans's lips. Miles turned to them, listening even more intently for having recognized just a few of those words. It was the Sumerian tongue, and he might as well not complain after Hans's poor pronunciation, since perhaps 6 fellows in all of Great Britain might done as well, himself included. I bid thee rise and serve. I bid thee rise and serve. I bid thee rise and serve. And something did. In the very center of the great circle, the light soon grew so bright as to render indecipherable the carvings and drawings that spawned it. The candles flared again, the quality of their light altering in a moment to match the circle's hellish red. Something lurched in Miles's stomach as he watched the coal glow in the middle of the circle flare taller than a man. The bonfire licked and roiled at the ceiling, but did not seduce the beams to alight with it, and suddenly a man did appear, stepping sideways through the flame to face Kenner and Hans. No, Miles saw, not a man, something taller. Its back was muscled like cordwood, and 2 long curled horns, growing backwards from its temples and down its skull to its neck in place of hair. The creature's flesh was gray, where it was not cracked and black from burns and other wounds. There were a few screams. One soldier dropped his rifle and ran for the patio door. Hans raised a pistol and shot him down before he reached the door, without breaking the pace of his oration. The creature in the circle seemed disinterested in the wails about him, even when Hans completed his recitation and stuffed the pistol back into the waist of his pants. When the creature looked up, Hans fixed him with a gleaming eye and nodded. Beyond the spitting and guttering of candle flame and the eerily burning cymbals, the room was silent. Miles bit his lip again, harshly, to use the pain, to use it now, to hide from the most complete fear he had ever known. Miles caught the whiff of the contents of a bladder newly emptied, and he crushed his hands into fists to avoid screaming for Hans to do something, for the love of God. But he knew instinctively that God would not be invited into the conversation Hans and the creature were about to have. The List, Part 2.